As we saw in the previous episode, Charles had reached Spain after a wild journey. He arrived at the wrong destination and was almost attacked by the locals, who believed his fleet was a foreign invasion. Now anchored, Charles had to deal with several critical issues. As historian Manuel Fernandez Álvarez puts it, Spain attracted, but also burned. First, his legitimacy. His imprisoned mother was still considered by many the rightful heir to the throne, and his younger brother Ferdinand was preferred by locals and nobles as he was born and raised in Castile. Second, Spain lacked stability. Before Charles's arrival, Cisneros, the experienced governor in charge, started to lose grip of his power, and when asked by a delegation, "By what powers do you govern?" he pointed at several artillery pieces and said, "These are the powers that the king left me." Third, the expeditionary force sent in 1517 to invade Algiers in North Africa had failed, and further east, the Ottomans successfully invaded Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, giving them sufficient resources to become a legitimate threat to Eastern Europe. And finally, Charles had to go on a long journey to meet with the courts of Spain and travel around his kingdom to strengthen his legitimacy. But while traveling around the rainy coast, the king fell ill, and the doctors, who suspected it was the atmosphere of the sea that caused it, recommended going through the treacherous mountains to Castile. This was a long and irritating journey. The king had spent 26 days in Spain and only traveled a mere 80 kilometers. Charles' final destination was Valladolid, where the courts awaited to coronate their new king. Yet, Charles had more important and personal matters, so he decided to visit his locked-up mother in nearby Tordesillas. But why was she locked up anyway? Was she really mad or crazy? Born in 1479, Joanna, or Juana para mis hispanohablantes, was the eldest daughter of the Catholic monarchs. She was strategically married to the Habsburg Philip the Handsome, who she fell madly in love with. Unfortunately for her, Philip was negligent towards her persistent love. Regardless, they left the Dutch territories where they resided, leaving behind their children, Eleanor and Charles. They then traveled to Spain to claim their joint Castilian throne after the death of her mother, Isabella. Things took a turn for the worse when, shortly after arriving in their territories, Philip died from an unexpected fever. This marked the beginning of what is often referred to as Joanna's madness. It is said that Philip traveled more around Castile in a coffin than he did on foot, as Joanna insisted on having him carried along with her at all times. Because of acts like this, historians have different interpretations of her mental health. Old stories describe her as a passionate lover, whose husband's death drove her to madness. 19th century historians describe her as a hysterical attention seeker, while 20th century historians prefer to diagnose her with schizophrenia and various other mental health issues. More modern interpretations, however, suggest that her craziness was a sort of political mechanism, as it became the only tool at her disposal after the allegation. Many accounts describe her as pretty regular when not in urgent situations, such as Henry VIII, who, after meeting her, described her as simply sane. Other accounts express that she was never heard to babble away like a lunatic. Yet, as with any interesting historical piece, this is still open to interpretation. Anyways, back to the story. When Charles walked in to see his mother, she was initially confused, repeatedly asking the king if he was actually her son, as Charles had grown so much since the last time she saw him. Despite this, the interaction was overall pleasing. During the visit, Charles met her younger sister Catherine for the first time, who was locked up with his mother. As the youngest child of Joanna and Philip, born after Philip's death, Catherine became a living memory of her mother's late husband, leading Joanna to attach to her desperately. When Charles first saw his younger sister, who would occasionally look out the window to watch other children play, he was shocked and acknowledged that something had to be done, but that would have to wait for a later occasion, as Charles made his way to Valladolid to meet with the courts. Although Charles left for his sleeping quarters, his advisor, the Lord of Chèvres, stayed to have a crucial conversation with the Queen, as it was essential to keep Charles's power as king and his mother under control. Historian Joseph Pérez views Charles's accession as a coup, due to the unprecedented strategy devised by Chèvres, resulting in Charles being proclaimed king alongside his mother Joanna. This type of legislation had never been seen before, but luckily for Charles, it worked. Yet, it wasn't until this conversation that his power as sovereign became official. In this 30-minute discussion, the previous coup would be legalized as Joanna agreed to give all power to Charles, and therefore she would only be queen by appearing on coins and paper. Sadly, this meant that for political reasons, the not-so-crazy queen would have to stay confined in Tordesillas to prevent any problems or civil war. Under the jurisdiction of the Marquis of Denia, appointed by Charles, a fantasy world was created around Joanna, who was repeatedly lied to. She was forbidden to talk to anyone outside the tower without supervision, and she was lied to about several issues, including the death of her own father. Some historians believe that Joanna was lied to perpetuate the myth of her craziness, but Denia explained that deception made her easier to control. In my opinion, it was probably both. On his way to Valladolid, Charles was greeted by his younger brother Ferdinand, who knelt before him. The encounter was heartwarming as they hugged and Charles honored his brother with the Order of the Golden Fleece. The three siblings then paraded into the streets of Valladolid, where, despite the festive atmosphere, there was palpable tension between the Flemish and Castilian nobles. As soon as the courts commenced, many members expressed their discontent and demanded that several issues be addressed. Charles was reminded that his mother was the rightful queen, and that his grandmother, Isabella the Catholic, had explicitly prohibited granting positions of power to foreigners, which Charles had already done. They also demanded that Charles learn Spanish and asked for his brother Ferdinand to stay in Spain, as he was the closest heir to the throne. It is even said that a brave Spanish gentleman told Charles, who always kept his mouth half open, to keep it shut, as the flies of Spain were annoying and one might get into his mouth. Anyways, Charles ignored many of these suggestions and requests, and, following the advice of his grandfather Maximilian, commenced preparations to get his brother out of Spain as fast as possible to reduce the probability of civil war. Ferdinand was sent to the Netherlands, but not without guarantees of future titles and land. This had the opposite effect Charles hoped, increasing tensions and upsetting many in Castile. He also betrayed the trust of the courts after the death of Cisneros, which left one of the most important positions in Castile, the Archbishop of Toledo, vacant. Here, Charles made a huge mistake by appointing Chevre's nephew, who was Dutch, to the respected position. But hey, by spring 1518, at least Charles was starting to communicate in Spanish, although in brief and formulaic sentences. After settling matters with the courts of Castile, Charles proceeded to the land of Aragon, where his reception was equally tense. Here, he received the news of the feats of an explorer named Hernán Cortés, and another explorer, Ferdinand Magellan, requested funding from Charles for a journey to find a route to Asia through the Americas. However, we will talk about the Americas in another episode, so let's just focus on Europe for now. While managing this part of the kingdom, Charles also concluded diplomatic talks with Portugal and sent his close sister Eleanor, who had been with him since childhood, to marry the King of Portugal. Anyhow, Charles traveled to Barcelona to meet with the Catalonians. However, during the journey, he received heartbreaking news. His grandfather, Maximilian I, had died. Although terribly tragic, as Charles had lost his main male role model, this opened new opportunities as elections were soon to be held in Germany to elect the next Holy Roman Emperor. This decision was in the hands of 7 powerful electors, 3 archbishops, 3 princes, and the King of Bohemia, who would all gather in Frankfurt for 3 months and vote. And these electors, let me tell you, were ready to accept all types of bribes and favors during this election. But who would be bold enough to aspire to this throne? First, of course, Charles I of Spain, who, although never having stepped on German land and didn't speak the language at all, emerged as the favorite, as his grandfather and previous emperor Maximilian had already negotiated for his favorite grandson to be the one who succeeded him. But this didn't assure anything, as I mentioned before, the electors had huge pockets ready for those bribes. And soon enough, the prominent figure of Francis I of France entered the race and changed everything. He had led France to a significant victory at the Battle of Marignano in September 1515, securing Milan and making his name known all around Europe. Even the mighty King of England, Henry VIII, entered the race. Though he was considered to be a long-shot contender, his bid added pressure to the election. Charles's chances didn't look so great, even so that his aunt Margaret of Austria, who was in charge of getting him elected, suggested that his exiled brother Ferdinand might have a better chance of being elected. But Charles did not like that, and demonstrated his persistence by doubling down. The bribing wars would begin. Charles was already considerably behind. Francis had already won over several electors and spread rumors about Charles's inability to rule, convincing them that he, with more experience and victories under his belt, was better suited for the position. Defeat for either would mean humiliation. The first move for Charles was to command Margaret of Austria to forbid all bankers in the Netherlands from loaning or transferring money outside the country without her confirmation. Later, and decisively, the most powerful bankers in Europe, the Fugger family, decided not to support the French, instead choosing to back up Charles. This granted him access to much-needed loans that turned the tide of the election. Additionally, the riches from the Americas commenced to arrive on Spanish shores, adding even more economic backup for the ambitious king. One by one, through expensive bribes and pensions amounting to an estimated 1 million to 1.5 million florins, and several matrimonial alliances, Charles slowly convinced the electors that he was the fitting candidate to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. Furthermore, Charles's numerous other titles meant that the princes, archbishops, and kings of the German lands would have more freedom to pursue their agendas, as Charles would be occupied with travel and the affairs of his other more demanding domains. In a unanimous vote, Charles had bought his way to becoming the next Holy Roman Emperor, multiplying his responsibilities and stress. And for the loser, Francis, he took this personally, commencing, as historian Robert Goodwin puts it, a relentless policy of retribution for the rest of his life. While preparing to leave for Germany in January 1520, Charles's spies reported that England, specifically the politically astute Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's favorite and closest advisor, had started diplomatic talks with France. They even planned a luxurious celebration that would be known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Which, I do know this guy that did a cool video about it, you might have to check it out. But anyways, Charles couldn't allow the largest armies, who had been bitter historical rivals, to unite against him and his new empire. Therefore, Charles planned to make a quick stop in England to visit his aunt Catherine of Aragon and his new uncle Henry VIII. But first, before leaving Spain, Charles had to assemble the courts once again to ask for money, not only for his upcoming travels, but also to pay back the debts that had secured his title of Holy Roman Emperor. And, to top it off, he ordered the courts to meet him in Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, further straying away from tradition and pissing them off. Instead, Charles met with them in the usual Valladolid, where the courts and the masses would loudly show their discontent towards the foreign king. The courts repeatedly asked for Charles to stay, who had only spent a couple months in Spain and was on his way to claim another foreign throne. Additionally, Charles didn't even talk with the courts to confirm if his decision to run was okay with them. Hearing these constant complaints, Charles was growing increasingly frustrated, and, as he finally lost his temper, the skies of Valladolid darkened, unleashing a thunderstorm as if sent by God himself. Outside the building, the masses were screaming, "Long live King Charles! Death to his evil counselors!" Charles and his hated advisors reacted quickly and fled the treacherous scene on their horses, making their way to Tordesillas so the king could visit his mother before leaving to claim his new empire. But at the city gates, an angry mob attempted to stop the king, forcing him and his group to fight to escape. After a short encounter with his mother, the fugitive king rushed to commence his trip to England and ultimately Germany. This is considered by many the start of what would later be known as the Revolt of the Comuneros, which, just like Charles, we will avoid now and go on detail later. On May 26, 1520, Charles's fleet arrived off the coast of Dover, where Wolsey greeted them warmly. Later that night, Henry and Catherine met with Charles at Canterbury, where they enjoyed some parties and feasts. Henry and Charles got on quite well, and there was even a marriage proposal between Charles and Henry's daughter Mary Tudor, but she might have been too young at the time for Charles to wait. After 5 days and a new alliance, Charles had outflanked Francis once again, who would meet with Henry later in June in the Field of the Cloth of Gold. After the successful meeting, Charles would make his way to Aachen, where the heavily romanticized figure on which the Holy Roman Empire was founded, Charlemagne, was buried. On October 23, 1520, after taking an oath, the ceremony began in the Cathedral of Charlemagne. The crown was placed on the head of the new Emperor of Europe, and the cathedral resonated to the sound of the crowd, who shouted,
Vivat Rex in aeternum.